welcome to today's Community Cast. My name is Matt Morgan. I'm the pastor at Community Brookside, a new church plant in Tulsa, Oklahoma. We are so blessed by your presence, and we hope that today's content will bring you joy. I'm not for sure about many of you guys, but when I was growing up, I knew that I had a dad who could fix nearly anything at all, right? I remember watching my dad do everything from engineering pine wood derby cars to tearing apart and rebuilding entire engines. My dad is so good at fixing things that I'm pretty sure that there's nothing he can't fix, as long as he had enough time and enough resources. So when I was younger, my dad's ingenuity really inspired me to try everything I could to fix things on my own too. I began working on cars when I was about 13 years old. And luckily, I inherited some of my dad's ingenuity and his skill when it came to fixing things. One of the things I remember seeing my dad do was that he would use whatever he could to fix something that was broken. I remember watching my dad fix a car window using duct tape, or leaky pipes sometimes using duct tape, or I watched him actually use a torch and soldering on a radiator, watching him trying to braze that thing shut when it had a puncture in it. I also watched him hang exhaust pipes using baling wire. Did I mention my dad used duct tape a lot? My dad was resourceful. He always used to tell me, son, use the right tool for the right job. But he would also tell me, do as I say, not as I do, because often I would see my dad banging on a screwdriver with the hammer as a chisel. Oftentimes, I would see him strip wires with his pocket knife rather than with wire strippers. So I was encouraged to do the right thing, but didn't always get the example of what doing the right thing looked like. But either way, my dad knew how to fix things, and my dad works with his hands even today and still knows how to fix things. My dad is pretty incredible. So my dad, I believe, had a test, right? And in his mind, I think this is what his test looked like. Let's show them this picture here. So I've got a picture here on the screen that basically it's my dad's kind of troubleshooting flow chart. So if something moves, should it? Well, if it does, you follow one line. If it does move and it should move, then everything is working great. If it does move and it shouldn't move, it's definitely time for the duct tape. Now, if it doesn't move, there's a whole separate line for that. So if it doesn't move, the question is then, should it move? Well, if the question is no, well, then there's no problem there. But if the answer to that is yes, it should move, but it doesn't, then WD-40 is the answer. So clearly, the two most used tools in any human's resources kit is duct tape and WD-40, right? Do you ever have any memories about things like that from your own childhood? Maybe your dad or your grandfather was incredibly good at fixing things. Maybe for you, it was your mother or an aunt, or maybe your sister was really good at fixing things. The problem is with fixing things is like we often can fix things that we recognize. We can often fix things that we can put our hands on. But the problem is, what do we do when the problems that we have to fix are so big? I'm talking specifically about our entire world right now. There's a lot going on in the world that many of us would love to be able to fix, but we probably just don't have the resources and the right abilities to do that. Things like global threats like hunger or polluted water, climate change, war, oppression, inequality, poverty, lack of education. There are spiritual issues at work in the world around us. There's a mistrust of the church. There's discrimination happening all around us against every aspect of humanity, from their people's race to their gender to their sexual preference to identity to any number of human traits. We find a way to divide, to discriminate against. There's an inability to do or say anything without dividing our country. COVID-19 currently is killing people and dividing our nation based on our willingness to wear masks or not. Everything in our world right now has become about identity politics. There's job losses at a rate that we've never seen before in our lifetimes. There's financial instability. And people are losing their homes around us, even in our own neighborhoods. And wouldn't we love to just have the right tools to fix all of that? There was a time in my life when I was a little kid that I believed for sure that my dad could do that. But I know now that tape and WD-40 aren't enough to fix the problems and the issues facing our world currently. But I'm reminded of a biblical book. There's a book in the Old Testament called the book of Esther, which is set in a time where the world looked kind of a lot like our world does now. The book of Esther presents us with a world like ours in such a way that we recognize that our problems that we're having now aren't new problems. They're not just specific to us, but problems in the world around us, in politics and money and financial systems and discrimination. Those things have been happening since the dawn of time. According to the book of Esther, Persia was ruled with an iron fist by a prideful dictator. The wealthy few were extremely wealthy, while most other people lived in extreme poverty. Women were denigrated and children were undervalued. Brutality was commonplace, and the Persians controlled the Israelites during this period of time. The book of Esther opens with the Persian king, King Xerxes, hosting a 6-month drunken brawl to celebrate himself, right? And why wouldn't you? I want us to read today from the book of Esther, chapter 1, verses 3 through 4. It'll be on your screen. You can follow along with us. It says, "In the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all his nobles and officials. He invited all the military officers of Persia and Media, as well as the princes and nobles of the provinces. The celebration lasted 180 days, a tremendous display of the opulent wealth of his empire and the pomp and splendor of his majesty." So at the end of this celebration, he asked for one of his wives, her name was Queen Vashti, to come in and entertain the men with him because of her beauty. But the problem is she refuses because she happened to be hosting a banquet of her own. And so because she didn't come in to visit the king when the king called her, the king became furious. And then after consulting with his nobles, he sends a letter to the entire kingdom with news that he has deposed Vashti, and she is no longer queen. And from this moment on, isn't only not queen, but she has been banished from his presence forever. And then, Scripture records in verse 22 in chapter 1 that the king goes even further. And you can see this here, it's written on the screen. Esther 1:22 says that every man should now be ruler of his own home and should say whatever he pleases. The king got so upset that he was embarrassed because his wife wouldn't obey him, that he now decreed that every man was ruler of his own home and that he could say or do whatever he wanted. That's how we run things in my house. That's not true. I'm sorry, Nicole. I love you. So that's the world in which our story takes place, a world where this ruler feels like he has complete authority over all aspects of life, and he can control the will and the wishes of people that he interacts with. A world where even if the queen makes a mistake or goes against the wishes of this great king, her husband, she's removed from power and kicked out of the kingdom entirely. If you compare that story to our story now, it's clear that some of our political leaders in our own time seem to have taken some lessons from King Xerxes. Xerxes asserted a kind of domineering patriarchy in his home and in his personal relationship with Queen Vashti. And then when he was defied, he set his sexist patriarchal norm as the rule of law for all men in the entirety of his whole kingdom. Scripture goes on to say in Esther chapter 2, 1 through 2, "But after Xerxes' anger had subsided, he began thinking about Vashti, what she had done, the decree that he had made. So his personal attendant suggested, well, let us search the empire to find a beautiful young virgin for the king. So the king's servant set out to find the most beautiful young women in all of the Persian Empire. And Hegai, who was in charge of the king's harem, was to give these young women facials and pedicures and spa treatments and beauty treatments so that he could then send these young virgins into the king. And if the king was pleased with them, he would choose them to join his harem of women and make one of them his queen instead of Vashti. The king's servants found a young Jewish woman named Esther, who was the niece of a man named Mordecai. And they brought this young woman named Esther to Hegai, the keeper of the harem. And the scripture goes on to kind of tell us a little bit more about this interaction, starting in Esther chapter 2, verses 8 through 11, and then continuing on in verse 16. Let's read that together. It says, as a result of the king's decree, Esther, along with many other young women, was brought to the king's harem at the fortress of Susa and placed in Hegai's care. Hegai was very impressed with Esther and treated her kindly. He quickly ordered a special menu for her and provided her with beauty treatments. He also assigned her 7 maids specially chosen from the king's palace, and he moved her and her maids into the best place in the harem. Esther had not told anyone her nationality and family background because Mordecai had directed her not to do so. Every day, Mordecai would take a walk near the courtyard of the harem to find out about Esther and what was happening to her. And if we continue on in verse 16, it goes on. Esther was taken to the king Xerxes at the royal palace in early winter of the 7th year of his reign. And the king loved Esther more than any of the other young women. He was so delighted with her that he set the royal crown on her head and declared her queen instead of Vashti. To celebrate the occasion, he gave a great banquet in Esther's honor for all his nobles and officials, declaring a public holiday for the provinces and giving generous gifts to everyone. Even after all the young women had been transferred to the second harem and Mordecai had become a palace official, Esther continued to keep her family background and nationality secret. She was still following Mordecai's directions, just as she did when she lived in his home. So Esther became clearly highly favored by the king Xerxes, and she was made queen. But no one knew where she was from or what people group she had come from. No one knew that she was a Jew. And that's integral to the story because later on in Esther, we're going to see a pretty violent shift. A little later on in the story, we get a chance to see that there was a murder plot that arose against the king, and Esther's uncle, Mordecai, would be instrumental in thwarting that plot. Because of the king's opulence and his mistreatment of his people, some of his subjects got very angry with the king, and 2 of his doormen that were his guards at the entrance of the king's private quarters decided they were going to assassinate the king. And then Mordecai happened to overhear those plans, and as he told the king, an investigation was launched, and when these 2 men were found guilty of trying to conspire to assassinate the king, they were both impaled on poles. And this was done so that the king could again show how powerful and strong he was and how willing he was to bring about retribution for anyone who would cross him. The world in Esther's time was very cruel. And then to add to this brutality, one of the king's most loyal and celebrated members of his court came up with a plan to rid the entire empire of the Jews in a sweeping act of genocide. This celebrated official, his name was Haman, he didn't like Mordecai because Mordecai wouldn't bow down to him. Mordecai believed that God was the only person that deserved a bent knee, but Haman placed himself above God and thought that every person should bow down to him. And when Mordecai refused, he decided that he wouldn't only get even with Mordecai, but instead would wipe out his entire people. He knew that Mordecai was a Jew, and so decided that all the Jews must pay the same price. A decree was sent out to the entire Persian Empire with directions on a certain day and a certain month for all the Persian residents to rise up against their Jewish neighbors. The decree encouraged murder and plundering of all Jewish people throughout the entirety of the Persian Empire. And all this because one royal official didn't have his ego stroked. He had a frail ego, and apparently Mordecai's refusal to bow was enough to make him call for genocide. In the world at this time, cruelty and murder and genocide came easily. When Mordecai found out about the decree to destroy the Jews, he sent word to now Queen Esther, and he called on her to use her God-given position to ask the king to relent from this decision from Haman to cause a genocide for the Hebrew people. And in chapter 4, we get to hear the whole story about what goes on as this plot begins to unfold. Let's read this together. This comes to us from Esther chapter 4, verses 1 through 17. It says, when Mordecai learned about all that had been done, he tore his clothes and he put on burlap and ashes, and he went out into the city crying with a loud and bitter wail. He went as far as the gate of the palace, for no one was allowed to enter the palace gate while wearing clothes of mourning. And as news of the king's decree reached all the provinces, there was great mourning among the Jews. They fasted and wept and wailed, and many people lay in burlap and ashes. When Queen Esther's maids and eunuchs came to her and told her about Mordecai, she was deeply distressed. She sent clothing to him to replace the burlap, but he refused it. Then Esther sent for Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs, who had been appointed to her as her attendant. She ordered him to go to Mordecai and find out what was troubling with him and why he was in mourning. So Hathach went out to Mordecai in the square in front of the palace gate. Mordecai told him the whole story, including the exact amount of money Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. Mordecai gave Hathach a copy of the decree issued in Susa that called for the death of all Jews. He asked Hathach to show it to Esther and explain the situation to her. He also asked Hathach to direct her to go to the king to beg for mercy and to plead for her people. So Hathach returned to Esther with Mordecai's message. Then Esther told Hathach to go back and relay this message to Mordecai. All the king's officials and even the people in the provinces know that anyone who appears before the king in his inner court without being invited is doomed to die unless the king holds out his gold scepter. And the king is not called for me to come to him for 30 days. So Hathach gave Esther's message to Mordecai. Mordecai sent this reply to Esther: don't think for a moment that because you're in the palace, you will escape when all other Jews are killed. If you keep quiet at a time like this, deliverance and relief for the Jews will arise from some other place, but you and your relatives will die. Who knows if perhaps you were made queen for just such a time as this? Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai: go and gather together all the Jews of Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will do the same, and then, though it is against the law, I will go in to see the king. If I must die, I must die. So Mordecai went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him. And then when Mordecai first pled with her to speak to the king to spare the lives of the Jews, we see that she responded with trepidation. In verse 11, all the king's officials and even the people in the provinces know that anyone who appears before the king in his inner court without being invited is doomed to die unless the king holds out his gold scepter. And she says, the king has not called for me for 30 days. I can't imagine being in Esther's position. She's being asked to go into a king who she knows if he doesn't welcome her, that she'll be murdered. And because she hasn't told anybody at all that she's a Jewish person, nobody knows that she's Jewish. She has that option of just pretending to be a different ethnicity where she wouldn't have to die. But either way, she's faced with some pretty extreme circumstances. And Mordecai has to convince her. Mordecai sends a response: don't think for a moment that because you're in the palace, you alone will escape when all other Jews are killed. If you keep quiet at a time like this, deliverance and relief for the Jews will arise from some other place, but you and your relatives will die. Who knows? Perhaps you were made queen for just such a time as this. From this exchange between Mordecai and Esther, it shows that her faith is growing. We learn some really big lessons about what to do when the world is broken and all things seem lost. And it seems like our religious rulers and our political rulers are at odds with one another. When people can't get along, when we get to look at the story of Esther, we have some things that we can look forward to. And some examples that the book of Esther sets for us, that when the world is going wrong, when things are happening in the way they shouldn't, how we as people of the church should respond. From looking at the story of Esther, we can find that there are a few things that any single one of us can do when we feel like our world is falling apart. and it's not following the order in which God created it. So let's talk for a moment about what this might look like for each of us to work towards the bettering of our world. First of all, much like Esther, we need to decide to be a part of the solution. So that doesn't mean that we might have the ability to solve every single one of the world's problems, but each of us, when we recognize that there are problems, we can be a part of the solution if we choose to be a part of the solution. We have plenty of analysts and commentators, news anchors and blog writers to point out the problems in our world, but very few are actually doing the work of solving the world's problems. Each of us has something to give to help the world, every single last one of us. But we have to decide to use our God-given gifts and our position to work towards bettering the whole of society, not just our own position, not just about, the world is not about us. The world is about living together and loving God and neighbor. God didn't give us our privilege or our power to use towards making ourselves better off, but to use that position and that power to better off all people. The gifts we have should never be exploited for our own betterment, but for the betterment of all. And I think today we need to hear that more than we've heard it in a long time. We've got to stop thinking the world was created for me and think that the world is created for all of us. Number two, we have to work for the good from wherever you are and from whoever you are. So I love this from author, speaker, and church planter Sharon Hottie Miller. She posted a tweet, and here's how the tweet goes. She says, Esther's first response to Mordecai was, I've not been called. Mordecai's response, your position and your privilege is your calling. Whatever each of us have in terms of our power, our position, our property, our prosperity, our prestige, whatever it is that we have, it's at our disposal for either good or for evil. So today, decide to use it for good. Why? Because found people find people. Redeemed people bring about redemption to people. Healed people should heal people. We are all stewards of the grace and the mercy and forgiveness that God has bestowed on us and given us freely. When we choose to use it to make the world better, we're doing what we've been created to do. We are living into God's purposes for our lives. The third thing we have to do is we have to speak with boldness for God's purposes, not our own. Not an agenda, not an ideal. We need to speak with boldness for God's purposes. Guess what, folks? It's not about you. It's about God and what God wants for us, His children. So when you see people hurting or oppressed, it's absolutely 100% right for each of us to be able to speak up. When you see injustice, it's not just right for us to speak up. It's our responsibility to act against it. And recently we've seen so much hurt in our world, and our response as people of faith should never be to write it off because these matters don't necessarily affect me directly. We have to be people with open eyes and open ears, and we have to be willing to speak out against things that are not of God. The book of Esther is a clear example of that for us today. Esther used her privilege, she used her voice to speak out when things were not looking like they should. She brought to the king, and we're going to learn more about this story next week, she brought to the king the plot from Haman to destroy all the Jews because it was not right, and she recognized it and used her position to do what was right. And number 4, we have to be willing to put everything on the line for what we believe in. Perhaps the most powerful thing that Esther did or said was, if I must die, I must die. She was willing to go to her death to make the difference that the world needed in that moment. And I have to admit that sometimes that particular thing affects me very, very deeply, right? And I have to question myself, am I really willing to lose what I've gained in this life for the betterment of others? Am I willing to give up my position, my comfort, my wealth for the betterment of others? Am I afraid to let go of worldly things so that godly things can prevail? And that's a hard question to ask ourselves. What are you holding on to? Is it property? Is it your privilege? Is it your life? We recognize that in Luke chapter 9:24, Jesus tells us if you try to hang on to your life, you will lose it. But if you give up your life for my sake, he says, you will save it. Through this incredible book of Esther, we are being called to give every single thing that we have, all of our ability, all of our energy, all of our passion, all of our resources, all of our privilege, to the causes that we know we should believe in, especially when those causes are connected to justice and righteousness, especially when it's connected to the things where God has created us equal and we've set up ways to break that equality. So church, this week, I'm calling all of us to look at our lives. Look at the places where we're privileged, where we have esteem. Look at the things that we have and find ways that we can use those things to make a difference in the lives of people around us. Our voices, our resources, our power can be used to make this hard world better for those who are underserved and underprivileged, but only if we make that choice. When we are willing, even if we're reluctantly willing, like Esther was, to lay our lives fully out on the line for the betterment of the world, I promise that God will honor that to accomplish through him more than we could ever do on our own. So friends, this week and always, let's make this world not just better for ourselves, but let us work and fight for making this world better for all people, especially for those who don't have the means to do it on their own. This week, I'm calling us to be the church that Christ has called us to be, to love our God and to love our neighbors as ourselves. Friends, the book of Esther is an incredible story of how one person, when presented with an opportunity to do right or do wrong, when she chose to do right, changes the entirety of the world and saves countless lives. Who knows? Maybe each of us will someday face a moment like that, where we are presented with opportunity to do good or to do wrong. And if we're presented with those opportunities, my prayer is that we will always choose to do right. We will always choose to side with our God and seek to love and serve those who are different than us, who are downtrodden, who are overlooked and oppressed. Let's be the church.
Thank you so much for joining us on today's Community Cast. We hope that you were blessed by today's conversation. If you'd like to know more about Community Brookside, please feel free to visit us at our website, communitybrookside.com, or find us on your favorite social media outlet. We hope to hear from you soon. Be blessed.